Hello to my North Dakota history students. This presentation is on contemporary politics. The book on North Dakota history that I've mentioned a few times, it's just called North Dakota History, a Bicentennial History. I'm sorry, it's North Dakota, a Bicentennial History by Robert Wilkins and Winona Wilkins. They have a chapter on North Dakota politics called Politics Cross-Grained, Complex, and Confusing. And that is really apt. We've seen already in this class that North Dakota is kind of a jumble of many things, a fairly conservative state generally, and yet in the early 20th century, home to the fairly radical nonpartisan league. And then for quite a while, we had the Republican Party allied with the Nonpartisan League. The Nonpartisan League was really not part of the Republican Party, but they tended to back Republican candidates. Now, after World War II, the Republican, or actually it was during World War II, in 1943, the Republican Organizing Committee was a movement by a group of Republicans in the state to try to break the Republican Party away from the nonpartisan league. In other words, to make it a true Republican Party like you would expect to find in other states. This Republican Organizing Committee also attracted people who disliked William Langer, even though he was a Republican. And they resented the kind of power or following that Langer seemed to have in the state. The final realignment came about in 1956 when the Nonpartisan League formally affiliated with the Democratic Party. And still today, the Democratic Party in North Dakota is formally the Democratic MPL Party. Minnesota has a similar type situation where it's the Democratic Farm Labor Party in Minnesota. Now, also coming out of the World War II era was a movement by some Republicans to defeat Senator Gerald P. Nye. Nye had been a major figure in the 1920s and 30s in the U.S. Senate. He chaired a commission that investigated whether or not the U.S. had been kind of maneuvered into World War I by companies that made arms and ammunition. Most scholars today think that the conclusions of this commission were incorrect, but they did conclude that the United States had been maneuvered. Now, this isolationism was popular with North Dakota people until Pearl Harbor. Now, when Pearl Harbor came, all three of the candidates, or all three of the people that were in the U.S. Congress from North Dakota voted for the declaration of war. But Nye said, this is just what the British had planned for us. We have been maneuvered into this by the president. So in other words, he saw the necessity of fighting against Japan, but he still had his strong isolationist tendencies. Now in the next election in 1944, Nye barely won the Republican nomination. And then John Moses, the incumbent Democratic governor, was the nominee for the Democratic Party. Now, during the campaign, Moses had some severe medical problems and spent a great deal of the fall of 1944 in the hospital at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. But he recovered enough to convince people that he was healthy. And he won the election But only 15 days after he was sworn in as a member of the U.S. Senate, he went back to the hospital and died on March 3rd, 1945. Now, to fill out the rest of the term that Moses had been elected to, Republican Governor Fred G. Ondal appointed Milton Young. Milton Young served from 1945 to 1981 in the United States. As this book cover shows, he became known as Mr. Wheat because obviously coming from North Dakota, he tried to do whatever he could to promote wheat farming, support the interests of wheat farmers in the U.S. Senate. Now, despite the controversial background of William Langer and the fact that people from North Dakota tried to convince the U.S. Senate not to seat him when he had been elected in 1940, he did serve from 1941 to 1959 with some distinction as a U.S. Senator. He died in office in 1959. A special election was held to fill the remainder of Langer's term, and Quentin Burdick was elected. Quentin Burdick was the son of Usher Burdick. Usher Burdick was a Republican who had served in the House from North Dakota from 1934 to 44. He decided not to run in 44 for re-election, but he decided to get back in and was elected in 48 and served until 1958. And Quentin Burdick, his son, was elected to fill the remainder of Langer's term. But Quentin Burdick was a Democrat. Now, in 1970, the U.S. Census brought about a reapportionment of the U.S. Congress, and North Dakota had 2 seats in the U.S. House, but this was cut to 1. Republican Mark Andrews was one of the men who had been an incumbent, and he was elected to hold the single seat in 1972. Now, in the notes that I've posted for you, there is quite a bit of material about the move to write a new constitution in 1972 for the state of North Dakota. But after all that work, it came down to being defeated pretty strongly by the people, a vote of 107,000 against to 64,000 in favor of the new constitution. But I'm not really going to go into that at all really here. Now, in recent times, North Dakota has kind of gone back to this cross-grained, complex, and confusing politics because North Dakota is generally a fairly strong hold of republicanism in the state and local government. And no Democratic candidate has carried North Dakota since Lyndon Johnson in 1964. Richard Nixon carried North Dakota every time he ran for president, 1960, 1968, and 1972. And yet, for a time in the 1990s and early 2000s, the North Dakota congressional delegation in Washington was all Democratic. Now, of course, it is true that the United States as a whole has seemed to be comfortable with this idea of divided government. We don't like, unless you're really a strong partisan of your own party, we don't like one party holding the White House and both houses of Congress at the same time. Now, Earl Pomeroy served he was born in Valley City, attended Valley City State University for a time, but had the good sense to get out of there and go to UND, where he graduated from UND and then from the UND Law School. He served in the North Dakota legislature from 1980 to 1995. He was a state insurance commissioner from 1985 to 1992. That might be thought of as kind of a lackluster job, of course, but the truth is that the insurance commissioner sometimes can intervene on behalf of customers and try to get insurance companies to treat them a little more fairly. And that means that the person who holds that office can build up a lot of public support. Now, Pomeroy was elected to the United States House in 1992 and served until he decided not until 2010 when he lost election. Rick Berg defeated Pomeroy in 2010. Some people think it was because people were upset with Pomeroy supporting Obamacare, but it probably was just in general. 2010 elections, even Obama himself said the Democratic Party really took a beating in those off-year elections, as they're called. So it was probably more just a general reaction against the Obama administration. Byron Dorgan was a member of the U.S. House from North Dakota from 1981 to 1992. And then he was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1992 and served until he retired in 2011. Kent Conrad was elected to the U.S. Senate from North Dakota in 1986 and served until he retired in 2012. So for a time there, as I said, in the 1990s and the early 2000s, our congressional delegation was Senator Kent Conrad, Senator Byron Dorgan, and House member Earl Pomeroy. Now, in 2012, Conrad decided not to run for re-election. Rick Berg, who, even though he's got some power in the Republican Party in North Dakota, some Republicans feel a little uneasy with him. He had served only one term in the House. He decided to try to move up to the Senate by trying to win Conrad's seat. Berg was defeated by the Democratic candidate Heidi Heitkamp. Republican Kevin Cramer was elected to North Dakota's lone House seat that Berg had given up when he tried to run for the Senate. Now, Heidi Heitkamp is another politician who illustrates the importance of holding state office. She was the state tax commissioner from 86 to 92. She was the Attorney General of North Dakota from 1992 to 2001. She ran for governor in 2000. I actually voted for her in 2000. She said she was going to stand at the border to keep railroad trains from bringing Canadian grain into North Dakota, and I thought that would be pretty neat to see. But she was diagnosed with cancer during that campaign and missed a lot of campaigning while in treatment. And so she lost the governor's race to the Republican John Hoeven. In 2018, Heitkamp ran for re-election. The Republicans had a commercial in the 2018 election that had a pretty, I think, a pretty accurate depiction. It had a woman saying, "Oh, I like Heidi. We all like Heidi." But the point was, personally, they had a high regard for her. But politically, they believed she had identified too closely with the National Democratic Party. And so Kevin Cramer, who was the incumbent House member, he had served 3 terms in the House by this time, he defeated her for the U.S. Senate seat. And in that same year, Republican Kelly Armstrong was elected to the U.S. House seat for North Dakota. So the current U.S. House or U.S. Congress delegation from North Dakota is the former governor, John Hoeven, Senator Kevin Cramer, and the U.S. House of Representatives member Kelly Armstrong. Now, why North Dakota sent these Democratic officials to Washington while voting Republican in the presidential election and often voting Republican at home? There are various theories for that. Some argue that many North Dakota farmers tend to think maybe the Democrats are more friendly to farm legislation. Also, North Dakota has a proportionally large elderly population, and many elderly think that maybe the Democrats are more likely to safeguard Social Security and things like that, although Republicans and Democrats both need to, voters of both parties need to take a look at how well have your members of Congress been caring for the concerns of the elderly in the last several elections. This is the last, to paraphrase Richard Nixon, this is my last press conference. No, not press conference, but my last video lecture to you. Normally, even in a regular class, if we had met all semester in a regular class, we wouldn't have covered everything. We've had to do kind of triage here online, covering only some high points. But now, as I told my U.S. class, we come to the end of this week, we can all join together in the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. As we think about the current political situation in America, where are all the good politicians when we really need them? I think this year I'm going to write in Richard Nixon, even though he's dead. I think he might be preferable to many of our current crop. Thank you and good night.